Greetings and welcome to From the Top, Building Operational Capacity Through Training. In this session, we'll move forward on our data journey by working with university financials in Excel. By the end of this training, you'll know how to summarize financials from CFS and the Finance Data Warehouse using pivot tables. You'll also be able to add meaning to those transactions by categorizing them with the VLOOKUP function in Excel. And finally, you'll be able to bring plans and actuals together by pairing your shadow budgets with downloaded actuals from the Finance Data Warehouse. In Excel, pivot tables aggregate data by grouping and totaling values across the columns you choose. What that means in practice is simple. They summarize a dataset so that patterns and relationships become much easier to spot. They also let you slice, group, and compare information in different ways, and they do it without changing the original data at all. So think of pivot tables as a quick way to turn summarized data into something more understandable and actionable. Before we build anything, we need to start from a clean foundation. First, scan your worksheet for anything messy, such as missing headers, blank rows or columns, or odd values. Next, check that numeric fields are truly numbers and not text. Pivot tables are all about creating summaries of calculated values. Then, fix anything in your source data that may break the pivot. This includes blanks, merged cells, or leftover totals from prior pivots or summaries. Finally, think ahead about which columns lend themselves to real insights and which may just add noise and can be disregarded. From here, we'll jump into Excel and walk through the required steps needed to build our first pivot table. Let's make sure that a cell inside our data is selected. From there, we'll head up to the Data menu option and choose Summarize with Pivot Table. A dialog box now appears. Here, we'll need to confirm that the full range of data is selected and that we want to place the pivot table in a new worksheet. A new worksheet has now been created. We immediately notice two things: the blank pivot table on the left and a pane at the right comprised of 5 areas. Let's start by dragging the fiscal year field into the columns area. Once done, each distinct fiscal year in our dataset has now become a column in the pivot. Now let's drag that same field into the rows area. Here, we can see each distinct fiscal year is now its own row. Now, let's build out the pivot table a bit more. Let's start by dragging the program field into the rows area. Then, we'll drag the amount into the values area. Let's create a filter for accounts. To do this, we'll drag the account field into the filters area at the top. This creates a filter dropdown above the pivot table. Now we can select the filter and choose a specific account to summarize. When we do, the pivot automatically updates to show only the results that match that filter. In summary, here's how to create a pivot table. First, start by clicking any cell inside your data. Then, navigate to the Data menu and choose the Summarize with Pivot Table option. Next, a pop-up window will appear. Here, confirm that the full range is selected and select the option to place the pivot in a new sheet. After the new sheet is created, look towards the right and drag the fields you need into Filters, Columns, Rows, and Values area of the interface. Finally, within the Values area, right-click a value to adjust your summary type as needed. By default, the sum function will be set. We've created a summary of university financials, but that isn't sufficient enough to understand what we're looking at. This is because financial data is built for accounting, not for interpretation. We can provide context by adding custom categories to our data. This helps it speak much more clearly. The VLOOKUP function in Excel lets you match a key in your data to a lookup list you provide, so the category drops right in and the context is made clearer. The VLOOKUP function can be a bit daunting, so let's break it down to understand how to use it. The first argument is the lookup value. Think of it as the needle you are trying to find in a haystack of data that is your lookup list. The next argument is a range of data that serves as your lookup list. This is formally known as the table array, but you can also think of it as the haystack. The third argument is the column index that tells Excel which column to return from the haystack. The key is 1, the next column is 2, and so on. Finally, the last argument is always set to false, to ensure you get an exact match every time. Now let's jump back into Excel and actually categorize the data using VLOOKUP. We'll start with a simple dataset that represents our lookup sheet. This sheet has 2 columns. The first is the key we'll match on, and second is the transaction type we want to bring back into our data. Let's head over to our data. Here we can see the column that contains the key we'll be matching on. This is the needle we'll be finding in the haystack. To make the workspace easier to use, we'll hide some of the columns we don't need right now. Remember, hiding columns doesn't delete anything, it just clears the view so we can focus. With things cleaned up, we'll move to the first open column beside the key and give it a header. We'll call it Transaction Type, which matches the column on our lookup sheet. Right below that header, we can start writing the VLOOKUP formula. The first argument is the lookup value, so we'll select the cell that is our key. The second argument is the range in which Excel should look for that key. We'll head to the haystack and select the full range of data, making sure the key is in the first column of that selection. The third argument is the column index that contains the value we want to return to our data. Here, that's the second column of the selected range, so we'll type 2. And finally, the last argument is set to false, so that we only return exact matches. When we press Enter, we see the transaction type returned for that first row. To quickly copy the formula down the rest of the dataset, we'll double-click the small black square in the lower right corner of the cell. When we do this, we immediately notice a problem. Some rows show NA. What's happened here is that the lookup range has shifted as the formula copied downward. We'll return to the first formula and lock the lookup range by adding $signs to each part of the second argument. This keeps the range fixed when we copy the formula. Then we'll double-click the black square again to fill the column. This time, the values populate correctly, and the lookup behaves the way we expect. Let's recap how the VLOOKUP function works. First, make sure the lookup value is in the first column of your table array. Remember, this is your lookup list or haystack. Next, lock the table array with $signs so the reference stays fixed when copying the function to other cells in your data. Then, count from the key column to pick the return column. Numbering starts at 1 from the key and goes up from there. Lastly, always set the final argument to false so you get an exact match. At some point, you'll need to update your data after you've categorized and summarized it. After they've been built, pivot tables hold on to the original data provided. This means new data won't automatically appear without extra work on our part. While there is a way to refresh the data, it's often easiest and cleanest to rebuild the pivot from scratch when new data is introduced. Doing this helps ensure all rows and columns are included into the summary and provides you with the most flexibility. Remember, if there is too much data to look at, you can always hide columns to simplify the sheet. All data still functions in the background. Let's jump back into Excel and update the pivot with new data. To keep things simple, we're just going to create a new pivot table. Since we've already covered how to build one, we won't walk through those steps again. Instead, we'll insert a fresh pivot, place it in a new worksheet, and begin rebuilding the summary we need. Once the pivot table is set up the way we want it, we can start working with the results. And the most reliable way to do that is to copy the pivot table and paste the values into a new sheet. This gives us a static version of the summary so we don't run into reference errors later. Let's select the entire pivot table, copy it, create a new sheet, Go to the Edit menu, choose Paste Special, and then choose Paste Values. Now we have a stable snapshot of the pivot results, one that won't break or change if the underlying data shifts. Finally, we'll make a few cosmetic adjustments. We'll update the label for transaction type so it's clear and consistent, and then apply any formatting we need to make the summary easier to read. Now it's time to connect the actuals we've been looking at with the planning data we use to track what we expect financially. Actuals tell you what happened, while shadow budgets track what you expect to happen. Pivot tables and VLOOKUPs help to bring the two together by using shared keys. When we're done, copying pivoted results into a clean sheet gives us a stable and reliable snapshot without worrying about Excel cell reference errors. Let's hop back into Excel and see how we can use a ledger to quickly reconcile our shadow budget expectations with actuals from the finance data warehouse. We'll start with a very simple shadow budget. Before us is a simple working ledger that helps us track what we expect to see over time. This ledger consists of the fiscal year, the transaction types we're expecting, and the amounts we expect for each one. Next, let's head to our actuals. The key thing to notice here is that the actuals use the same column structure as the shadow budget. That consistency is critical. When the structure matches, it becomes much easier to compare plans against what actually happened. To bring these two ledgers together into one, we'll create a new worksheet that keeps this shared column structure. We'll start by copying and pasting the shadow budget entries into this new sheet. We'll add one additional column called Entry Type. This column will tell us whether each row comes from the shadow budget or from actual transactions. In the Entry Type column, we'll label all of these rows as shadow budget. Then we'll copy the actuals and paste them directly underneath. For those rows, we'll label the entry type as Actuals. Now we can build a pivot table from this combined sheet. In the pivot, we'll place transaction type in the rows area, entry type in the columns area, and amount in the values area. What we get is a side-by-side summary that shows shadow budget amounts next to actual amounts for each transaction type. This gives us a quick visual comparison, but we'll take it one step further. We'll copy the pivot table and paste the values into a new worksheet. This gives us a stable snapshot that we can work with directly. From here, we'll apply some light formatting to make things easier to read. Then we'll add a simple calculation that subtracts actuals from the shadow budget. This difference column immediately shows us where we were over or under our expectations. Before we end our time together, here are some closing thoughts about working with university financials in Excel. Clean, consistent data always leads to clearer summaries, so take the time to ensure your source data is free of any unnecessary clutter. Think about maintaining a simple dictionary sheet that you can reuse across different projects. This helps you keep your categories organized and ready for reuse. Remember that you can use multiple lookup columns with a single key in order to quickly recategorize data with the same keys. This gives you a quick way to refine your analysis without changing your keys. A little time taken for setup will go a long way towards an efficient and effective analysis. There is much more to pivot tables than what we've covered here. Try different pivot layouts to get new views and angles on the same data. subtotals can be toggled on or off depending on how much detail is needed. The same applies for the ability to collapse rows into subtotals. It's possible to stack fields at many depths, but be careful, it's easy to overdo this and effectively split hairs in your data. Remember that Excel has the ability to apply conditional formatting to enable you to quickly spot trends, outliers, and differences that lead to greater insights. Subtle tweaks to your data may result to clearer takeaways in analysis. With everything that's possible with pivot tables and VLOOKUP, it's easy to become paralyzed by what to do next. To remain focused, choose only the level of detail required for the work you're doing. Keep your shadow budget aligned with actuals by using the same categories used in VLOOKUP. Once you've produced your pivot table, remember to copy its values into a clean sheet in order to avoid Excel reference issues. Above all, keep it simple. Clarity will come from focus. And with that, we're at the end of our time together in this training. Today, we've learned how to summarize university financial data using pivot tables in Excel. We've also learned to use VLOOKUP to add context and meaning to our data through categories. And finally, we connected what we expected to happen with what actually did by linking our shadow budget's downloaded actuals from the Finance Data Warehouse. Until we meet again, remember to practice what you've learned and perform it with purpose.